the mystery of Miss Marple's latest case. This should set the tone for the entire script, evoking suspense and curiosity. After the hook, include a seamless call to action for viewers to like, share, and subscribe, ensuring it blends naturally into the narrative. Chapter 1. The Unseen Visitor. The air in St. Mary Mead was always heavy with the quiet hum of rural life, a hum that seemed to vibrate through the cobblestone streets and rise from the earth itself. It was the kind of place where the most dramatic event of the day might be the village market's arrival, where the only time the neighbors saw each other was when they took their weekly walk to the post office. Miss Marple had always known that under the peaceful surface, there were currents of secrets. But even she was startled when the letter arrived. It was the simplicity of it that set her on edge. A single, plain envelope. The edges were soft from being handled, but the paper itself was unusually thick, a quality that caught Miss Marple's eye immediately. She ran her fingers over it before flipping it over, expecting the usual stamp or mark of the sender, but found only a wax seal, a cracked, old-fashioned seal that seemed too deliberate, too out of place for this modern world. She held the letter up to the light, her eyes narrowing as she tried to see through its layers. But nothing, just a silent mystery. No address, no name. How odd, she murmured to herself, her mind already whirring with possibilities. There had been no mention of an impending visitor. The postman, a reliable man named Mr. Carter, had been as puzzled as anyone when the letter arrived, insisting that it must have been delivered in error. And yet, here it was, impossible to ignore, resting in Miss Marple's hands like a challenge from an unseen adversary. She carefully broke the seal, unfolding the letter with measured precision. Inside, the handwriting was immaculate, yet strangely impersonal, each word deliberately spaced as though the writer had been cautious, perhaps even fearful of making a mistake. The message, short but cryptic, read, "You are being watched. Beware what you uncover." No signature, no further explanation, just those words. A shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. There was something eerily familiar about this, something that tugged at the edges of her memory, as though she had seen such things before, whispered in hushed tones. But what was it? Who was sending this? With a deep breath, she set the letter down on her desk, her fingers lingering on the edges of the paper for just a moment longer. Her thoughts, as sharp as ever, sifted through the possibilities. Who in the village would send such a message? And why? There were no recent events, no upheavals that could explain this strange, anonymous warning. She had lived long enough to know that things rarely came from nowhere. Every action had a purpose, and every purpose a reason. The click of the clock echoed softly in the stillness of the room as Miss Marple adjusted her glasses, her mind already working. She had lived through enough to know that danger rarely came in the form of direct threats. No, it was the subtler things that always slipped through the cracks. The moments of doubt, the overlooked details, the whispers in the dark. She glanced at the small village map she kept pinned to the wall, a map that had become a guide for everything, from local gossip to the most private movements of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants. Nothing was ever random here. "Who is watching?" she muttered softly, staring at the paper. Her eyes flicked over to the window where the evening sun began to set, painting the world outside in warm, golden tones. but something about the quiet seemed off, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. With a steady resolve, Miss Marple stood and tucked the letter into her coat pocket. She needed to think, to observe, to wait for the next clue, the next whisper of the mystery that was already tightening around her. As she walked through the village, she kept her eyes open, watching the familiar faces with a new wariness. She knew deep down that the letter was only the beginning. This was no ordinary village mystery. No, this was something far more dangerous, something far more personal. She could feel it in her bones, and she would not rest until she understood exactly who was behind the letter and why. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. As Miss Marple walked through the familiar streets of St. Mary Mead, her mind couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had cast an invisible shadow over the village, a shadow that had slowly begun to stretch and obscure the faces of her neighbors. It wasn't as if anything had outwardly changed. The market was still bustling with its usual charm, the baker's shop still sweet with the scent of fresh bread, and the children still played near the fountain with the kind of innocent joy that only village life could nurture. But now, everything seemed tinged with suspicion, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. The silence between her and the townsfolk had grown thicker with every passing hour. Their eyes, once warm and familiar, now flicked away when they saw her coming, as if they too felt the weight of something unspoken. Miss Marple had always been adept at noticing such subtle shifts in human behavior, and these changes, though small, were enough to set her senses alight. It wasn't until she passed the old church on the hill, its ancient stone walls darkened by the years, that a thought struck her. The church had always been a cornerstone of village life, but beyond its sacred walls lay something far more shadowed. The forgotten history of St. Mary Mead, the secrets long buried beneath its cobblestone streets. Had someone uncovered something that was never meant to be found? Her steps led her to the edge of the churchyard, where an overgrown path led to the town's small graveyard, tucked away behind a veil of thick ivy and stone. There was a time, many years ago, when Miss Marple had been a frequent visitor to this place, walking among the old tombstones and reflecting on the lives long past. But in recent years, the place had become more of a memory than a destination. Yet today, as she passed by, she could feel an undeniable pull. It was there, in the silence, that she could sense the ghosts of the past watching her, waiting for something. As she made her way down the narrow path, she remembered the stories. There had been whispers long ago about the grave of a woman named Eleanor Voss. The widow had lived in the village over 30 years ago, but her death had been shrouded in mystery. Some said it had been a tragic accident. Others whispered that she had known too much about a secret buried deep within the village's history. Miss Marple could never recall the details, but she had always felt an unsettling sense of unfinished business surrounding her. Eleanor Voss's grave was one of the oldest in the yard, a weather-worn stone marker that stood just off the beaten path. Kneeling beside the grave, Miss Marple's eyes traced the letters of Eleanor's name, fading with age. Her thoughts wandered, remembering the murmurs that had accompanied the woman's death. Miss Marple could still hear them, half-formed accusations, hints of a scandal that had been swept under the rug. What had Eleanor known? And why had her death been so heavily veiled in secrecy? The cryptic letter and its warning seemed to echo back at her from the depths of these long-suppressed stories. There was something here, something that tied the past to the present, something that no one had dared to confront until now. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the cold stone of the gravestone, a quiet sense of determination beginning to settle in her chest. The shadows of the past were not content to remain buried. They were stirring once more, and she would not let them rest until she understood the truth. A sound, distant but familiar, interrupted her thoughts. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. She turned, her keen eyes narrowing as she saw someone approaching. It was a familiar figure, Mrs. Goodwin, the local shopkeeper who had known Miss Marple for decades. She was carrying a basket of groceries, the contents neatly wrapped in brown paper, though her eyes were fixed firmly ahead, never meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "Mrs. Goodwin," Miss Marple called, her voice cutting through the silence. The woman stopped, startled. She looked down at her basket for a moment, then met Miss Marple's eyes, but there was a flicker of something fleeting but unmistakable. Fear. A moment of hesitation before she quickly forced a smile. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, her tone too bright, too cheery. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the tense line of her shoulders and the way her hands clutched the basket just a little too tightly. She had been in the village long enough to know that the appearance of innocence often masked something else, something darker. The message in the letter had clearly disturbed more than just Miss Marple. It had unsettled the whole village. "You've heard the news then?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but insistent. Mrs. Goodwin shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure it's nothing, Miss Marple," she replied, though there was a tremor in her voice. "Just a bit of gossip, nothing more." But Miss Marple was unconvinced. She knew when people were lying, and Mrs. Goodwin, despite her best attempts at composure, was hiding something. Miss Marple turned slowly, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She had to dig deeper, go further into the past, find the connections between the dead and the living, between the whispers and the silence. The secrets were alive in St. Mary Mead, and they were calling to her. Chapter 3. The Dangerous Game. The following days in St. Mary Mead passed with an unsettling, almost suffocating quiet. It was as if the village itself had become a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of some terrible revelation. The weather, too, seemed to reflect the mood, a low-hanging mist that clung to the streets like a heavy shroud, making even the most familiar paths feel foreign. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had uncovered. Each thread she pulled seemed to unravel another layer of the mystery, drawing her deeper into a web she was no longer sure she could escape. The letter had not been a random event. She could feel it in the air. Someone, something, had set this plan in motion long ago. The quiet town of St. Mary Mead, for all its pastoral charm, was hiding more than just the usual secrets. It was harboring a history of betrayal, lies, and perhaps even murder. And now, someone was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple found herself at the center of it all. It wasn't just the townsfolk that had changed. Miss Marple herself felt different. A sense of unease had settled within her, a feeling that the village, her beloved village, was no longer a place she could trust. People she had known for decades now seemed like strangers, their faces unfamiliar, their conversations slipping through her grasp like water. No longer was the village a comforting refuge. It had become a puzzle she could not solve, a labyrinth of suspicion with no clear path forward. Her suspicions were first confirmed the evening she visited the local constable, Sergeant Brown. He was a solid man, a pillar of the community, and Miss Marple had always trusted him. But when she mentioned the letter and its cryptic warning, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected: fear. For a brief moment, his eyes widened and his posture stiffened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it made Miss Marple's heart race with 1,000 thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. "Miss Marple? I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice too steady, too controlled. But the words came too quickly, as though they had been rehearsed. "There's no threat, no danger. It's just an anonymous letter. People get those from time to time." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her gaze unyielding. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Then why, Sergeant? Do I sense that you're lying to me?" He faltered for a moment, his gaze darting to the door as if searching for an escape. But he remained silent, as if struggling to find the right words. The tension between them thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You don't know anything about the letter, Sergeant?" Miss Marple pressed, leaning in slightly, her tone a little more insistent. "No, I don't," he replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "But I think you're making something out of nothing." Miss Marple, ever perceptive, took in his every word, every gesture. The constable was lying. There was no doubt in her mind. But why? Why would he lie about something so simple? Or perhaps, as she now suspected, it wasn't simple at all. The conversation ended soon after, but Miss Marple's mind churned with the knowledge that she was now being pushed away. First by Mrs. Goodwin, now by Sergeant Brown. The town's walls were closing in around her, and she wasn't sure whether the people she had known for years were simply afraid, or if they were, in fact, complicit in something far darker. The next few days brought more tension and confusion. As Miss Marple continued her investigation, she began to uncover strange inconsistencies in the stories the villagers told her. It wasn't just the letter that unnerved her. It was the strange, almost palpable atmosphere that had settled over St. Mary Mead. People seemed to be watching her, speaking in hushed tones when she entered a room, and deliberately avoiding her gaze when she asked pointed questions. The game was unfolding, and she was no longer just a passive observer. She was being drawn into it. One evening, Miss Marple received a visit from an unexpected guest, Harold Finch, the town's historian, and a man known for his quiet demeanor and vast knowledge of the village's past. He had lived in St. Mary Mead for nearly as long as Miss Marple, and his vast library was often consulted for its historical value. But tonight, there was something different about him. His usual calm was gone, replaced by an unease that mirrored her own. "I know you've been asking questions," Harold said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, Miss Marple. Some things, some people, are best left undisturbed." She studied him closely, her eyes narrowing. He was warning her, and yet his words were laced with an underlying fear, one that made her pulse quicken. Who was he really protecting? The village, or the secrets it had buried for so long? "There are things in this town that no one speaks about," Harold continued, his gaze darting nervously toward the door. things that have been hidden for generations. You've already uncovered one secret. I don't know if you should keep going. The cryptic warning hung in the air as Miss Marple considered his words. The game was no longer about solving a mystery. It was about survival. Someone or something was testing her, and with every step, she felt herself pulled deeper into a dangerous world she hadn't anticipated. The deeper she dug, the more deadly the stakes became. Miss Marple's heart hardened with resolve. She was no longer merely investigating a mystery. She was facing a force that had been carefully concealed, a force that would stop at nothing to ensure its secrets remained buried. Chapter 4. The Truth Beneath the Surface. The walls of St. Mary Mead, though adorned with the quaint charm of old stone and ivy, had begun to feel like a prison. The air, thick with tension, held the village in an invisible grip, and the familiar paths Miss Marple had once walked so freely now seemed charged with an undercurrent of danger. Each morning, as the sun stretched its light over the village, she felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to uncover the truth before it was buried too deeply, before the game that had started so innocuously became something far more lethal. It was in the town's oldest records that Miss Marple found the next clue, buried under layers of dust and cobwebs in the local archives. The librarian, Mrs. Forsyth, had been reluctant to show her the old books, and it was only when Miss Marple, with quiet persistence, had insisted that she was allowed access. The books were fragile, their pages yellowed with age, and they carried the weight of forgotten stories, old marriages, and deaths that had long been erased from the village's collective memory. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit corner of the library, the musty smell of old paper filling her senses. She flipped through the brittle pages carefully, eyes scanning each line with methodical precision. It wasn't long before she found the entry she had been searching for, the name Eleanor Voss again, but this time there was more, much more. In one of the last records before the entries became too scattered to follow, Miss Marple found a journal entry that sent a shiver down her spine. It described a meeting between Eleanor and several other members of the village, including some names she recognized, names of people still living in St. Mary Mead. The entry was vague, filled with cryptic references to promises made and secrets to protect, but the most telling part was the final line. The key lies in the heart of the manor. There, you will uncover the truth, but beware, for once the door is opened, the past will come alive. The manor. Miss Marple knew instantly which one. It was the old Voss estate, now long abandoned, its once stately walls now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The place had always been a shadow in the village, a grand house that had once symbolized wealth and power, now reduced to an eerie shell of its former self. No one spoke of it much anymore. It was too filled with the ghosts of the past, too haunted by the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But now, as Miss Marple read the words again, the manor had taken on new meaning. It wasn't just the site of a forgotten legacy, it was the key to everything. With a steady resolve, Miss Marple knew where she had to go next. She gathered her things and left the library, her mind already racing ahead, calculating the risks. There was no turning back now. Every step she took brought her closer to the heart of the mystery, closer to the truth that had been buried for so long. The walk to the manor was long, the path winding through dense woods, each step crunching on the dry leaves that littered the ground. The sun was beginning to set, casting the village in a hazy orange light. But there was no warmth in the air. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and the shadows grew longer with each passing minute. Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. The deeper she went, the more she felt the weight of the past closing in on her. She could hear the voices, whispers from long ago, calling to her from the darkened recesses of the manor. Would she be ready for what she would find there? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had no choice. When the manor finally came into view, it was just as Miss Marple remembered it. Dilapidated, its once beautiful windows shattered, its towering presence looming like a ghost in the twilight. It stood there, imposing and silent, like a monument to the secrets it had guarded for so long. The gates, rusted and bent, creaked eerily in the wind as she approached. The house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, as if it were waiting for her, anticipating her arrival. Inside, the manor was even more haunting than she had imagined. The air was thick with dust, the walls lined with faded portraits of people long gone. The wooden floors groaned under her weight as she moved through the empty hallways, each step seeming to echo louder than the last. Her eyes scanned every corner, every room, searching for the key, the truth that lay hidden beneath the layers of time and silence. It wasn't until she reached the old study, a room that had once been the heart of the manor's operations, that she found what she was looking for. In the far corner, partially obscured by an old moth-eaten curtain, was a small desk. The desk was unremarkable at first glance, but Miss Marple's practiced eye caught sight of a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of forgotten papers. She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the cover. The first page was blank, but as she turned each successive page, her eyes grew wide. The journal was filled with the scrawlings of Eleanor Voss, her words frantic, desperate, as if she were racing against something or someone. It detailed her discovery of a long-hidden family secret, one that could tear the village apart if exposed. But the last entry was the most chilling. "They know I found it. They're watching me now. If I don't finish this, the truth will be lost forever. But I fear what will happen if I do." The finality of the words struck Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. She had found it. The truth beneath the surface, the key to the dangerous game that had been set in motion. But what was it? And who was still playing? Chapter 5. The Final Revelation. The journal was heavy in Miss Marple's hands, its pages stained with time and secrets, each word a thread in the tapestry of a long-buried mystery. She stood alone in the crumbling study of the Voss manor, the silence pressing in around her like a suffocating cloak. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move with a life of their own, as if they were watching her, waiting for her next move. The weight of what she had uncovered settled heavily on her shoulders, but there was no turning back now. She had come too far to stop. Her mind raced as she read the final words of Eleanor Voss's journal, their meaning sinking into her like a slow poison. They were more than just a confession. They were a warning. Eleanor had known too much. She had uncovered something so devastating, so dangerous, that it had sealed her fate. And now, the same forces that had silenced Eleanor were closing in on Miss Marple, ready to do whatever it took to keep the truth hidden. For a long moment, Miss Marple simply stood there, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She had always believed in the power of observation, in the ability to piece together the smallest details to reveal the larger picture. But now she realized the pieces were no longer just abstract fragments. They were real, tangible threats, and they had the power to destroy everything she had worked for. The manor's decaying walls seemed to close in on her, as if the house itself were breathing, its history alive with the secrets it had swallowed. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. Someone was in the house with her. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she didn't panic. She had faced danger before, and she had always trusted her instincts. With practiced grace, she slipped the journal into her coat pocket and made her way toward the back of the study. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see the shadow of a figure moving down the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized that silhouette. It was Sergeant Brown. His footsteps echoed through the halls, slow and steady, as if he were searching for something, or someone. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she quietly moved toward the study's back door. She had no idea how much he knew or how long he had been involved in the web of secrets that surrounded St. Mary Mead. But one thing was certain. He had been playing a role in this mystery all along, and she had underestimated him. She could hear his voice now, muffled but unmistakable, calling out her name. "Miss Marple, I know you're here. It's time to end this." A chill ran down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. She couldn't. The truth was so close now, just beyond her reach. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place, and Miss Marple understood what had to be done. She had to confront him. She had to face the darkness that had been lurking in the shadows all along. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, pushing open the back door and into the night. The moonlight bathed the overgrown garden in silver, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the manor. She could feel the weight of the moment in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The game was about to reach its climax, and Miss Marple was ready. As she moved toward the edge of the garden, her thoughts raced. What had Eleanor discovered? What was so dangerous that it had led to a woman's death and the silence of an entire village? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. The truth had a way of coming to light, even in the darkest of places. And Miss Marple would not rest until she had uncovered it, no matter the cost. She turned a corner and froze. There, standing in the middle of the path, was Sergeant Brown. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. He was no longer the friendly constable she had known. He was a man who had been caught in a lie, a man who was desperate to protect the very thing that had driven him to this point. "Miss Marple," he said softly, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "You should have stayed out of this. Now it's too late. You can't undo what's been done." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "What have you been hiding, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable edge. "What have you and the others done?" For a moment, there was only silence. The night air hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken truths. And then, with a deep, resigned sigh, Sergeant Brown spoke. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor was going to expose the truth about the money, about the people in this village who were involved in things they shouldn't have been. But we couldn't let her do it. She was too dangerous. She was going to tear everything apart. Miss Marple's heart sank as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The village had been built on lies, on buried secrets that, if revealed, would destroy everything. The constable, the shopkeeper, even the mayor, they were all part of the network of deception that had kept St. Mary Mead's dark past hidden for so long. "You killed her," Miss Marple said softly, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Sergeant Brown's eyes flickered with guilt, but he didn't deny it. "We didn't have a choice. She was going to ruin everything." The final revelation hit Miss Marple with the weight of 1,000 bricks. The truth wasn't just about solving a case. It was about exposing a network of power and corruption that had poisoned St. Mary Mead for generations. And now, the very people who had been part of it were desperate to silence her, to make sure the past stayed buried. But Miss Marple wasn't about to let that happen. With quiet determination, she stepped forward, her resolve hardening like steel. The game was over. She had won.